My name is Mike. David is preparing to launch his new book, Get to the Point, Make Every Word Count. In a world drowned in noise, a leader's greatest tool is not their title, it is their voice. Yet, most leaders bankrupt their influence by wasting words on idle talk and information clutter. In Get to the Point, David provides a high-level strategic manual for the wise steward who is ready to make every word an investment. Using the chess versus checkers framework, this book reveals how to master the two most important boards of leadership: the precision of chess, how to use calculated, individualized words to mentor, position, and build people for the long term; the momentum of checkers, how to use decisive double jumps to clear away conflict, stop excuses, and restore peace in an instant. We have a saying here: we don't say goodbye, we say, until the trumpet blows. In the meantime, let's push forward until he comes. Now, please enjoy the podcast from our team.
I'm Steve.
And I'm Trinity.
We are the CA Jail Outreach Digital Community Team, and this is a Growth Journey, a deep dive podcast.
Right. And, before we really get into the weeds today, we want to talk about the heart behind why we even do this.
Absolutely. CA Jail Outreach is entirely dedicated to providing a really solid foundation for re-entry and transformation.
Yeah, because we exist for inmates and their families during, frankly, some of the most overwhelming and isolating times imaginable.
It's a heavy burden. And a massive part of that mission, right, is Camp Growth.
Oh, Camp Growth is incredible. It has a national reach for youth, providing this crucial sanctuary and, mentorship for children who are navigating these heavy, completely unearned challenges.
The challenge of having an incarcerated parent. It's a lot for a kid.
It really is. So we want to ask you, the listener, right up front, please keep these children in your thoughts and prayers.
Definitely. Keep them in your prayers. So this focus on transformation, on really speaking words that build a foundation, it bridges us perfectly to the material we're exploring today.
It does. Today, we are unpacking the foundational text written by our CEO and founder, David Avritt.
Yeah, the title of his work is Get to the Point, Make Every Word Count.
And just a quick disclaimer for you listening to maximize our time together on this deep dive, we're really going to focus on the key insights.
Right, the high-level stuff.
Exactly. But you can, and you absolutely should, visit the website linked right down in the description for the full version of David's writings.
Yeah, because that full version includes all the comprehensive scriptures and the complete operational frameworks. We just can't cover every single nuance today.
We'd be here for hours.
We really would. But what is genuinely fascinating here is the sheer breadth of perspective that David brings to this subject.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he isn't just sitting in an ivory tower offering, theoretical communication tips.
Right. His 54-year life journey was forged through rigorous military service.
And extensive executive education, plus incredibly dedicated Bible training.
Yeah. He is a veteran, a CEO, and a visionary leader. Basically, he's the architect of this entire methodology.
Which is why his insights are so grounded in reality.
Okay, let's unpack this architecture right off the bat. Because early on in David's writings, he refers to himself with a very specific, unique title.
He does.
He calls himself a Bible Mentalist.
Yes.
And I have to be honest, that is not a phrase you hear every day.
No, it really isn't.
When I first read it, my mind immediately went to, stage magicians or something. So what does that actually mean in a practical leadership context?
I love that you brought that up because it's such a brilliant distinction. A Bible mentalist doesn't just read the word as an intellectual exercise,
Right.
or treat it strictly as a historical document. They actively analyze the human heart and the human mind to unlock a true growth journey.
Okay, so it's about taking deep spiritual truths and aligning them with human thought.
Exactly. It aligns spiritual truth with the intricate, often messy complexities of human behavior to break generational cycles through faith-based restoration.
Wow, so it's very command-led.
Highly command-led. The philosophy is that every single word counts, and every single work must be committed to the Father.
Because when you align your labor like that, your purpose becomes immovable.
Precisely. And that brings us right to the subtitle of David's writings.
Oh man, this subtitle. It honestly stopped me in my tracks when I read it.
It's provocative, right?
Very. The subtitle is, Stop Wasting Your Breath. Start Moving Mountains.
It demands an immediate, uncomfortable audit of your own daily behavior.
It really does. Because, we live in this overwhelmingly noisy culture.
The noise is constant.
Right. And I think So often, we assume our greatest tool as a leader is our formal title, or maybe our budget, or our social media reach.
But David is making the argument that a leader's greatest tool is simply their voice.
Right.
Yet we completely bankrupt our own influence by spending that voice on what he calls idle talk and information clutter.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, David is essentially framing our words as a high-level strategic investment.
Yes, which ties deeply into the biblical concept of stewardship.
Right, and usually when we hear stewardship, we immediately think of managing money, or maybe our time.
Exactly. But David is asking, what about the stewardship of your breath?
Wow, that's heavy.
It is. God gave you breath to speak life, to command order out of chaos, right?
Right.
So if you squander that finite breath on meaningless jargon and defensive rambling, you are failing as a steward.
You're just bankrupting your influence.
Exactly. So the natural question is, how do we become wise stewards of that breath?
And to answer that, David introduces this incredible central metaphor that structures his entire philosophy.
The chess versus checkers framework.
Yes. And he makes this brilliant historical point that the greatest minds in history didn't just play these board games to pass the time.
No, they used them as a mental gymnasium. Let's look at the roots. Chess, which was originally known as Chaturanga, originated in India around the 6th century.
Okay.
And it was specifically engineered to teach royalty and military leaders how to manage different complex types of power.
Right, because every piece on a chessboard has a different capability. It's inherently a game of long-term strategy.
Precisely. The knight jumps, the bishop slants. But then contrast that with checkers.
Or drafts, right, which traces back thousands of years earlier to the ancient city of Ur and the tombs of Egypt.
Yes. Checkers is not about complex diversity at all. It is entirely about swift momentum.
Right, all your pieces start the same, they move the same way. The goal is rapid clearance.
So you have long-term power management versus swift momentum.
And let me try to put an analogy to this just to see if I'm grasping the practical side.
Go for it.
Imagine you are trying to deeply mentor someone. You're trying to guide them through a complex emotional issue.
Okay.
But you are treating them like a checkers piece. You just want a quick jump, a quick fix, a simple yes or no so you can move on.
You're going to crush their spirit.
Exactly. But inversely, and here is where it gets really interesting for me, imagine your house is actively on fire.
Total crisis.
Right? A total immediate crisis. And you are standing in the hallway trying to play by chess rules.
Oh, wow.
You're analyzing the long-term emotional impact of the fire on the neighborhood rather than just screaming, get out of the house right now.
That is a phenomenal distillation. If you do not know which board you are playing on, you cannot make a move that matters.
You'll either overanalyze a crisis or you'll bulldoze a delicate situation.
Exactly. So that brings up the million-dollar question for you listening. How do you know which board you are actually standing on a random Tuesday morning?
Yeah, how do we figure that out?
David addresses this through what he calls the discipline of thought, and specifically strategic time allocation.
Right, he breaks this down into 3 distinct zones of thinking time.
What's brilliant here is how it takes the abstract idea of strategy and makes it an actual calendar event.
I love that. So zone 1 is the nightly review.
Yes, he suggests taking 15 to 30 minutes every single evening.
And this is for the stewardship of the day's tasks, and crucially for identifying the frog for the next morning.
Ah, the classic Mark Twain concept. If it's your job to eat a frog, it's best to do it first thing in the morning.
Right, meaning you identify the absolute hardest, most important task before you do anything else.
You find the frog at night, so you don't waste your morning breath looking for it.
That makes so much sense. Then you have zone 2, which is the weekly deep dive.
And this requires 60 to 90 minutes of unbroken time. You have to physically pull yourself out of the daily weeds.
You review the overall health of your organization or your family, and you plan your moves 5 to 10 steps ahead.
This is your dedicated, protected chess time.
And finally, zone 3 is tactical reaction.
Right, this is real-time, immediate problem solving. A client is angry, a pipe burst.
A kid is throwing a tantrum.
Exactly. This is checkers time. So for you listening, thinking about how to apply this to your own life, this structure can fundamentally cure that feeling of being totally overwhelmed.
Because if you try to do your weekly deep dive while your phone is ringing off the hook with daily fires, you will paralyze yourself.
You have to separate the boards.
Which brings us to perhaps the most critical step in David's entire framework.
It is the step that must occur before a single word is ever spoken.
David calls it the pre-move scan, or reading the room.
Think about competitive play. A true grandmaster never just walks up to a board, sits down, and immediately touches a piece.
Right, they scan. They absorb the entire environment first.
And according to David's writings, they're scanning for two very specific things. First, they scan for clutter.
Meaning, is the person you're about to speak to completely overwhelmed by stress or confusion?
Yes, because if their board is cluttered, your words won't land. And second, they are checking the lanes.
Is there an open path to their heart? Or have they built up massive defensive walls?
To really ground this concept, David points to what I consider the ultimate biblical masterclass of the pre-move scan.
Oh, the story of Nehemiah's night ride.
Yes, let's set the scene. Nehemiah has just traveled a massive distance to Jerusalem.
And he knows the city walls are in ruins.
Right. The people living there are demoralized, vulnerable, exhausted. Now, Nehemiah arrives with letters of authority from the king of Persia.
So he actually has the resources to fix this.
He does, but he doesn't just ride into town, gather a crowd, and start shouting orders.
Right, he didn't spend a single gold coin of his words yet. He kept his breath in his lungs.
Exactly. The scriptural accuracy of how David presents this is crucial. Let's look closely at Nehemiah 2, verse 12.
Okay.
Nehemiah writes, "And I arose in the night, neither told I any man what my God had put in my heart to do at Jerusalem."
Wow.
He literally snuck out in the dead of night, riding his animal through the rubble, surveying the absolute ruin in total, unbroken silence.
Because silence is the best preparation for a strategic move. Think about the alternative.
Oh, it would have been a disaster.
If he had spoken too soon, if he had just started casting vision before he knew the reality of the damage, he would have created panic.
Or tipped off his political enemies.
Yeah. Or he would have just wasted his breath on terrified people who were not yet mentally ready to hear a massive construction plan.
He needed to know the exact physical and psychological state of the board before he deployed his pieces.
So to help us execute that same level of discipline, David provides 10 strategic questions that leaders must use to scan their own boards.
And this list is truly where we separate the masters from the amateurs.
I want us to really take our time and dissect these questions, because David frames them as binaries.
Understanding these binaries is the core of the whole framework.
Let's group a few of them together. Question 1. Is this about building a person or solving a problem?
David states that building a person requires the long-term nuance of chess, but solving a sudden problem requires checkers.
That perfectly aligns with question 2. Does this current move require speed, or does it require depth?
Speed is the momentum of checkers. Depth is the strategy of chess.
Now, here is question 3, and I have to tell you, this one hit me right between the eyes when I read it.
It's a tough one.
The question is, am I dealing with a unique gift or a standard excuse?
What's fascinating here is how often well-meaning leaders confuse those two things.
Absolutely.
A unique gift or raw talent in an individual requires chess. You have to navigate it carefully so it can grow.
Right.
But a standard excuse, that requires checkers. You do not psychoanalyze an excuse. You jump over it and remove it from the board.
Okay, let me push back on that for a second. Because that sounds great in theory, but it feels incredibly tricky in practice.
How so?
How do I, as a manager or a parent, actually distinguish between an excuse that just needs a quick checkers jump to clear it out and a genuine need that requires chess-level mentoring? How do I know I'm not just being insensitive?
That right there is the true art of leadership. You have to think about the language being used.
Okay.
An excuse usually sounds like a standardized defensive repetition. It sounds like, well, we just don't have the time, or that's really not my job.
Oh, right. Or we've never done it that way before.
Exactly. It's an automatic reflex designed to protect the status quo. A genuine need, however, usually involves a specific lack of tools or a lack of clear knowledge.
Okay, that makes sense.
If an employee says, "I don't understand how this software works," that is a lack of tools. You play chess. You sit down and equip them.
But if it's just a lazy reflex...
You play checkers to clear it and force momentum.
Okay, that clarifies it beautifully.
Mm-hmm.
Let's look at the next few questions. Question 4. Is the board cluttered with conflict that needs to be cleared immediately?
If yes, that's checkers.
Question 5. Does this individual need to be mentored into their king row potential?
If yes, that is chess. Question 6. Am I protecting the core mission, or am I just pushing the daily plan?
Projecting the core mission requires the long-term positioning of chess, right?
Yes. Pushing the daily schedule requires the momentum of checkers.
Question 7. Is the current conversation stuck in a stalemate of analysis? You know those meetings where you were just talking in circles for an hour?
Oh, we've all been there. David says if you hit that stalemate, you have to consciously move to checkers to break the paralysis.
Question 8. Do I need a knight's move to approach a sensitive issue from the side?
Because direct, head-on confrontation isn't always wise. Sometimes you need the lateral, unexpected movement of chess to bypass a defensive wall.
Question 9. Are the distractions in the room actively stopping the task at hand? If yes, execute a checkers jump right now.
And finally, question 10, is this a season of sowing, which requires the patience of chess, or a season of harvest, which requires the rapid execution of checkers?
By running that scan, by literally pausing before you speak and asking those questions, you ensure that the words you are about to spend are mathematically calibrated to the actual reality of the situation.
Exactly. So let's say we've done the scam.
Okay.
And we realize we are in a crisis or we are drowning in excuses. We need momentum.
That brings us to section 3 of David's writings, The Checker's Mindset, which is entirely about mastering momentum.
The mechanics of checkers are fascinating when you apply them to human behavior.
They really are.
Think about a physical game of checkers. It is all about forward momentum. It is about clearing the opponent's pieces.
And in our lives, those pieces represent excuses, distractions, toxic attitudes, bureaucratic red tape.
Right. You clear them as fast as possible with absolute linear precision.
David outlines 3 core components to this momentum. First is the reactionary loop.
In high-speed environments or in active crisis management, you do not have time to call a committee meeting. You see a move, you make a move.
Instantly. Second is standardized management.
This means utilizing standard operating procedures, or SOPs, to ensure the move is made the exact same way every single time.
You do not reinvent the wheel while the building is burning.
Exactly. You rely on ingrained consistency.
And third is linear execution. This means stripping away all the theoretical what-ifs. You just focus on the direct straight line path forward and you hit the jump.
To illustrate this, David points to a few modern masters of momentum. He brings up President Harry Truman.
Oh, who is famously known for the literal sign he kept on his desk, "The buck stops here."
That is the essence of pure checkers. No passing the blame down the line, no endless academic analysis. The decision happens right here, right now.
He also mentions Ray Kroc, the man responsible for building the McDonald's empire.
Kroc is a fascinating study because he didn't invent the hamburger. He didn't even invent the fast food restaurant.
Right. What Ray Kroc invented was the momentum.
He cleared the path of competition by creating a rigidly uniform system for rapid, unstoppable expansion.
But I have to say, the biblical examples David pulls to illustrate checkers' momentum are just stunning. They are visceral. Let's talk about the story of Ehud.
The historical account of Ehud is what David defines as the ultimate clearance jump.
Right, let's look at the context. The nation of Israel had been under the severe oppression of a Moabite king named Eglon for 18 years.
Paying heavy tribute, suffering under foreign rule. Now, Ehud was chosen to deliver this tribute, and Scripture notes a very specific tactical detail about Ehud. He was a left-handed man.
Which, in the ancient world, was highly unusual. And it meant he carried his weapon on his right thigh.
Completely bypassing standard security protocols because guards naturally checked the left thigh.
Wow, so he literally bypassed the bureaucracy of the royal court.
He secured a private audience with King Eglon under the guise of having a secret message, and in one swift, brutal, decisive action, he removed the oppressor from the board.
Let's look at the exact wording in Judges 3, verse 20. Ehud approaches the king and says, "I have a message from God unto thee."
And then he executed the move with a hidden dagger. It wasn't a debate. It wasn't a treaty negotiation.
It was a clearance jump to save a nation.
And then David brings up the story of Jael. He calls her move the triple jump.
This story is incredibly intense.
It is. The Israelites had just defeated the Canaanite army. The oppressive commander, Sisera, fled on foot. He was exhausted, sought refuge in the tent of Jael.
Thinking he was safe there because her husband was an ally.
Jael welcomes him in. She gives him milk, covers him with a heavy blanket, and waits patiently for him to fall asleep.
And then, well, David describes the mechanics of what happens next. Let's look at Judges 4, verse 21.
Jael took a tent peg and a hammer, crept up to him softly, and drove the peg straight through his temples and down into the ground.
Wow. With one rapid, absolute move, she cleared the board of a general who represented 20 years of brutal oppression.
What these deeply historical, frankly violent accounts illustrate in David's framework is the absolute necessity of decisive action.
Right. When you are dealing with toxic forces or systemic oppression, you cannot negotiate with it. You must clear it.
So how do we practically apply this today without, using actual daggers and tent pegs in the office?
Yeah, please no tent pegs at work.
Exactly. David translates this into 5 strategic checkers moves for modern leadership. Let's really break these down for the listener.
Move number 1 is the sacrifice for clearance.
This strategy is based on Proverbs 15, verse 1, which states that a soft answer turns away wrath.
In a game of checkers, sometimes you intentionally leave a pawn exposed, right?
Yes, you let the opponent jump it, specifically so you can open up the board and take 3 of their pieces on your next turn.
So in leadership, this means sometimes you have to give up a minor win in a petty argument.
You let a stubborn colleague have their way on a minor detail, specifically to clear the board of tension and keep the momentum of the actual project moving forward.
I love that. You sacrifice the ego win for the mission win. Move 2 is the double corner squeeze.
In the board game, if you can trap your opponent's piece in the corner, they are legally paralyzed.
David applies this to the act of boxing in an excuse to force focus, based on James 5, verse 12. Let your yea be yea and your nay, nay.
Think about an employee who constantly says, I'll try to get it done, or maybe we can look at it next week.
The double corner squeeze is saying, I don't need try or maybe. I need a yes or a no. Are we hitting Friday's deadline?
You squeeze out the ambiguity so they are forced to meet their potential.
Move 3 is the forced jump. We see the mechanics of this in Matthew 18, verse 15.
Which commands us to go directly, privately, to a brother who has trespassed against us. Human nature wants to avoid conflict.
We want to gossip about it or ignore it. The forced jump is the discipline of initiating the uncomfortable conversation everyone else is avoiding.
Specifically to clear the board of underlying resentment before it rots the culture.
Move 4 is the king row pivot, or what David calls the leadershift.
In checkers, when a standard piece fights its way to the opposite end of the board, it gets crowned. It becomes a king.
And suddenly it has the authority to move backwards as well as forwards.
David ties this powerful concept to Revelation 2, verse 5. Remember, therefore, from whence thou art fallen, and repent, and do the first works.
It is about having the ultimate humility to look backwards, acknowledge a previous error, repent of it, and fix it.
So you can move forward again with double the power and credibility.
And move 5 is the blitz. This is found in Ecclesiastes 9, verse 10. Whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, do it with thy might.
When you finally get a breakthrough, a sudden surge in sales, a breakthrough in your child's behavior, you do not take a vacation.
You initiate a blitz. You maintain high energy and relentless execution to keep the momentum moving until the board is secured.
But to execute these 5 moves, you have to speak the right language. You have to use what David calls the checkers dialect,
which is the language of absolute clarity and rapid clearance. He breaks this dialect down into 2 specific types of words. First, hard words.
Now, we need to clarify this. Hard words are not cruel words. They are not abusive.
Right. They are what the scripture calls the faithful wounds of a friend from Proverbs 27, verse 6.
They are unyielding, concrete words used to stop bad habits instantly, like telling a friend, you need to stop drinking, or telling an employee, this behavior is unacceptable.
And the second part of the dialect is decisive words. This is the binary yes or no.
It is the language of the commander on the battlefield. Decisive words refuse to let what David calls information debt slow down the mission.
Right. If someone asks you for a decision and you give a long, meandering 50-word maybe, you have just created a debt of confusion.
And your team now has to spend hours trying to pay off that debt by guessing what you actually meant. The checkers dialect clears the debt instantly with a yes, proceed, or no halt.
Okay, let's take a breath and pivot the board completely. We have mastered the momentum. Now we move into section 4 of David's writings, the chess mindset,
which shifts us entirely into the realm of strategic depth.
The contrast here is what makes the framework so robust. Because in checkers, all your pieces are identical.
But in chess, the royal game, every single piece possesses a different capability.
Right. The knight jumps in an L shape. The bishop moves diagonally.
David explains that this beautifully represents the vast diversity of the people in your life, your family, and your organization.
And the mental process here is completely different from the reactionary loop of checkers. Chess is not about reacting. It is about anticipation.
David says you cannot wait for a crisis to occur. You have to sit quietly and ask yourself, if I do X, what is the most likely response from the board 3 moves from now?
It also requires intense resource allocation. Because every piece has a unique move, You must match specific talents to specific missions.
You cannot treat your team members as interchangeable cogs. You don't send a rook to do a knight's job.
And perhaps the toughest emotional part of this mindset, positional sacrifice.
Oh, this is the willingness to accept a painful short-term loss. Sacrificing a pawn, losing a little face, taking a temporary hit to profits.
All in order to secure a massive long-term victory for the core mission.
David points to modern architectural thinkers to illustrate this deep mindset. Bill Gates is presented as a prime example.
Right, because during the rise of Microsoft, Gates didn't just build a software product. He built an architecture of future moves.
He was constantly looking 10 years down the board, anticipating where technology and consumer behavior were going to intersect.
David also mentions Arnold Schwarzenegger, which I found to be a genuinely fascinating inclusion. He calls Arnold a multi-board master.
Think about it. Arnold used the intense mental discipline of chess, calculating long-term counter-moves, and applied it across completely different industries.
Dominating bodybuilding, then pivoting to real estate, then Hollywood, and finally politics.
And David also highlights General Stanley McChrystal, who utilized systems thinking in modern warfare.
Right, understanding that integrating special forces, local intelligence, and tribal alliances is what actually wins complex wars.
But again, it is the biblical strategist lessons where this concept gets incredibly deep and practical. Let's look at the story of Hushai the Archite.
Yes, this is from 2 Samuel 17, verse 7. Such a brilliant story of espionage and strategy.
It truly is. King David's son, Absalom, had launched a massive rebellion and usurped the throne.
And Absalom had an advisor named Ahithophel, who was notoriously brilliant but had turned traitor.
Ahithophel advised Absalom to attack King David immediately that very night.
Which was a total checkers move of
Yes.
rapid momentum. If Absalom had done that, David would have been destroyed.
But Hushai, who was secretly loyal to King David, stepped into the council. Hushai knew he had to stop the momentum.
So he used incredibly poetic, terrifying, ego-stroking language. He painted a picture of David as a fierce bear robbed of her cubs.
He convinced Absalom to wait, to gather a massive, overwhelming army from all of Israel instead of attacking immediately.
He forced Absalom into a chess game of overanalysis and delay.
And that strategic delay is exactly what gave King David the time he needed to cross the river, escape, and regroup his forces.
Hushai literally positioned his words to change the timeline of a war.
And then there's the account of the daughters of Zelophehad.
Oh, this is such an empowering, structurally brilliant story. We find this in Numbers 27, verse 4.
These 5 sisters approached Moses and the leadership of Israel. Their father had died without leaving any sons.
Now, under the rigid legal precedent of the time, their family name would be erased, and their father's land would be lost completely.
They didn't come into the camp screaming. They didn't start a riot. They understood the legal board they were playing on.
They used highly precise, structurally sound, respectful words to petition Moses for a positional shift in the inheritance law.
And they won. God confirmed their request, and they won their inheritance.
They made a legal, strategic chess move that forever changed the precedent and history for women in the nation of Israel.
So, just like we did with checkers, let's give the listener the 5 strategic chess moves they can use in their own lives today.
Move number 1 is the pawn to queen promotion.
This concept is beautifully based on 1 Samuel 2, verse 8. He raiseth up the poor out of the dust.
In the game of chess, if a lowly pawn survives the entire journey across the board, it's promoted to a queen, the most powerful piece.
In our lives, this is the long-term patient mentoring of overlooked potential. You might look at a struggling teenager or an entry-level employee and just see a pawn.
But if you invest the time to guide them across the board, you can promote them into a high-level leader.
Move 2 is castling. In chess, this is a very special defensive move where the king tucks away safely behind a rook.
David links this directly to Proverbs 18, verse 10. The name of the Lord is a strong tower.
In practical leadership, castling means having the foresight to step in front of a looming crisis to actively protect your core mission and your integrity.
Move 3 is the knight's fork. A fork is a highly tactical move where the knight lands on a square that allows it to attack 2 different opponent pieces simultaneously.
David ties this to Proverbs 25, verse 11. A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in pictures of silver.
This is the high-level communication skill of using one carefully crafted conversation to gracefully address 2 separate delicate issues at the exact same time.
Without causing offense or triggering defenses, move 4 is the gambit.
This is a classic chess opening where you intentionally sacrifice a pawn right out of the gate to gain positional advantage.
David applies this to human relationships as sacrificing your own ego. You admit a mistake first. You apologize first.
James 5, verse 16 says to confess your faults one to another. It is a strategic, disarming vulnerability that wins deep, long-term trust.
And move 5 is a concept called Zugzwang. This is a German chess term that literally translates to compulsion to move.
Okay.
It describes an agonizing situation where it is a player's turn, but absolutely any move they make will significantly worsen their position.
Wow.
David applies this concept to the strategic use of silence in conversation. Proverbs 10, verse 19 says, "He that refrains his lips is wise."
Okay, I have to stop and push back on this one.
Yes.
Because I think a lot of listeners will hear this and think, wait, so if I am in a heated negotiation, remaining completely silent forces the other person to worsen their position.
It's totally counterintuitive, isn't it?
Yeah. Doesn't silence just make me look weak or unprepared or like, I don't know what to say?
It is a great pushback because our culture equates talking with power. But think about the psychological weight of deliberate silence. Let's say an employee gives you a terrible, meandering excuse for missing a deadline. If you immediately jump in and start arguing with them, you give them something to push against. You legitimize the debate.
Oh, I see.
But if you simply look at them and remain entirely silent, the silence becomes deafening. The pressure transfers entirely to them.
They feel the compulsion to fill the void, so they keep talking.
And usually, in their nervous rambling, they end up exposing the absurdity of their own excuse, or they end up confessing the real issue.
Silence is an incredibly heavy chess piece.
Wow. Okay, I completely see that now. You let them talk themselves into a corner.
Exactly. And to do this effectively, we have to speak the chess dialect, which is the language of extreme precision and positioning.
David talks about using soft words, referencing Proverbs 25, verse 15. A soft tongue breaketh the bone.
These are carefully calibrated words designed to break down a person's defensive resistance without breaking their spirit.
He also identifies wise words. This is the language of the architect. It is used to explain the deep why behind a decision and to paint a vivid, compelling vision of the future. The ultimate masterclass example David gives of this is Nathan the prophet confronting King David.
Context here. King David had committed a horrific series of sins, adultery with Bathsheba and the murder of her husband Uriah.
Now, Nathan is tasked with confronting the most powerful man in the nation. Nathan didn't kick the door open and yell a list of rules.
Right.
He didn't waste 10,000 words of general abstract theology. He knew that King David's defensive walls would be 10 feet thick.
So he played a masterful game of chess. He walked in and simply told the story. He told a parable about a rich man who cruelly stole a poor man's one beloved little ewe lamb to feed a guest.
He engaged King David's innate royal sense of justice. King David gets furious at the rich man in the story and demands justice.
And then, only when the lane to the heart was wide open, Nathan delivered the surgical punchline with absolute precision, "Thou art the man."
He bypassed all the royal defenses and got straight to the point of the heart. Every single syllable in that story was a seed carefully planted for a future harvest of true repentance.
He spoke specifically to move a broken soul into its king row.
This material is just incredibly rich. Which brings us to Section 5, the dual board master, and breaking the stalemate.
Because the reality is, we don't live in a vacuum. We live in a world that requires us to navigate both boards constantly.
What's fascinating here is how David analyzes the integration of these two leadership styles. Now, purely as an objective analysis of tactical mechanics, David presents Donald Trump as an example of a modern leader who operates on both boards simultaneously.
Right, and just to be clear for you listening, maintaining strict neutrality here as we simply analyze the behavioral mechanics described in the text.
Exactly. We are just looking at the framework. David points out Trump's checkers mastery, his public approach, is heavily rooted in direct, immediate tactical moves.
He focuses on the immediate jump.
He uses blunt confrontation and leverage to instantly reset the momentum of a room. He removes the traditional pieces of political bureaucracy extremely fast, forcing immediate focus on the deal at hand.
But David also highlights his chess mastery operating underneath that. While he is executing at that rapid checker speed, he is simultaneously positioning with chess depth.
David notes this is often referred to in the media as playing 4D chess. He understands the long-term narrative positioning.
He anticipates how a seemingly chaotic jump today will shift the entire board, force his opponents into predictable reactions, and position his brand months or even years down the line.
It perfectly illustrates the macro concept of war versus battle. Chess wins the long war, checkers wins the immediate battle.
David strongly advises that as a leader, you must spend the vast majority of your proactive thinking time on chess, that weekly deep dive we talked about, to anticipate and prevent future crises.
But your mind must remain highly agile. You must be able to snap into checkers, tactical reaction, the second the moment demands immediate execution.
He calls this the paradox of the kings. In the game of chess, the entire overarching goal is to protect your king at all costs, which David equates to protecting your foundational integrity.
But in checkers, the goal is the opposite. It is to promote your piece into a king, which represents gaining the authority to move forward and backward freely to enforce standards.
So what does this all mean for us when we inevitably get stuck? David addresses a concept called breaking the stalemate.
In a game of chess, a stalemate occurs when a player has no legal moves left to make, but their king is not actively in check. The game just freezes. It's a draw.
In leadership, if your heavy chess analysis has completely stalled a project, if you are just having meeting after meeting, analyzing data, but zero forward progress is being made, you must intentionally pivot.
You literally step off the complex chessboard and you step onto the checkers board.
You stop the endless talk, you stop analyzing the hypothetical risks, and you make one decisive linear checkers move to forcefully restart the momentum. You say, we're launching phase 1 on Monday. Go.
But that pivot requires immense courage, and it requires a remarkably tight grip on our verbal currency.
Which brings us to section 6 of the writings, the currency of influence, in treating words as gold.
In the economy of the kingdom and in the economy of leadership, you simply cannot be a spendthrift with your breath.
David provides a sobering list of counterfeit currency phrases we use constantly because we think they make it sound polite or collaborative, but they actually actively destroy our value.
He calls them the 10-point killers. Let's read just a few of these. Listen to how familiar they sound. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but...
Or basically what I'm trying to say is,
sorry to bother you, but...
if I'm being perfectly frank.
This might be a stupid question, but...
Okay, I have to pause and push back on one specific phrase on his list. The phrase is, does that make sense?
Yes.
I have to confess, I use this phrase all the time. I use it constantly in meetings, and my intention is pure. I use it because I want to be helpful. I want to make sure the listener is actually following my train of thought. Why is that considered counterfeit currency? Why is that bad?
It is a very common question and a great point of pushback. Here is exactly why it acts as counterfeit currency. It creates unnecessary clutter, and it subtly undermines your own leadership authority.
Wait, how so?
When you finish an explanation and ask, does that make sense? You are subconsciously signaling to the room that you have insecurity about your own ability to explain things clearly.
Oh, wow. I never thought of it like that.
Furthermore, it places the entire burden of understanding onto the listener. If they don't understand, you've just made them feel stupid if they say no in front of everyone.
Wow. Okay, that completely flips my perspective on that. So what is the practical gold standard replacement for that phrase?
Instead of asking the insecure question, does that make sense?
Hmm?
You confidently own the communication. You state, I want to ensure I explain that strategy clearly. What are your initial thoughts?
Or simply, what specific questions do you have about this rollout? You take ownership of the clarity and you warmly invite specific, actionable feedback without making anyone feel dumb.
That is so much stronger. It completely changes the posture of the conversation. Now, David also lists 10 jargon words to avoid. These are corporate staples.
Things like, it is what it is, let's circle back on that, we need to think outside the box, we'll see how it goes.
But there are 2 specific phrases on this list that are deeply cultural, especially in faith-based communities or Southern environments, and David goes right after them.
Yes, he does. And they are heavy hitters. Using the phrases praying for you or bless your heart as a dismissal or a deflection. That one stings because we have all seen it and probably done it. It is so true. Using beautiful spiritual language to mask your exit strategy from a difficult, necessary conversation is the ultimate counterfeit currency.
It severely devalues actual intercessory prayer. If we are truly commanded to value our breath like gold coins, we must ensure that our words are rare, heavily grounded, and aimed strictly at the truth.
Instead of saying, well, I was just thinking about maybe we could possibly try to, you state the clear action. I recommend we execute this plan. Stop apologizing for taking up space on the board. Stop inflating your speech with fluff.
To really drive this reality home, Section 7 of David's writings is called The Treasury of the Wise. He gives us profound character lessons from biblical figures to help us practically apply these dialect principles.
Let's look deeply at the story of Abigail.
Abigail is presented as the ultimate model of a high-value investment. The context is incredible. Her husband, Nabal, was a wealthy but foolish man. He had deeply publicly insulted David, who was not yet king, but a powerful warlord at the time.
David was furious. He was marching toward Nabal's estate with 400 heavily armed men, vowing to slaughter every male in the household.
Now, Abigail gets word of this. She doesn't panic. She doesn't hide. She intercepts David on the road with a massive provision of food.
But more importantly, she intercepts him with gold words of profound humility and brilliant chess-like foresight.
1 Samuel 25, verse 24. She fell at his feet, and she literally took the blame for her foolish husband upon herself.
But here is the chess move. She reminded David of his own long-term God-given destiny. She essentially said, "You are going to be the king of Israel. Do you really want the petty blood of this foolish man staining your conscience when you take the throne?"
She completely de-escalated a warlord. She invested her precise prophetic words to save her entire household from annihilation.
Then we have Manoah's wife. David called her the ultimate filter.
Manoah had just been visited by an angel of the Lord who announced the upcoming birth of Samson. Manoah was absolutely terrified, completely convinced that because they had seen God, they were going to die immediately.
He was spiraling in panic. But his wife didn't join his panic. She used a single gold-plated fact to correct his fear.
Look at Judges 13, verse 23. She logically, calmly pointed out that if the Lord had truly meant to kill them, he wouldn't have accepted their burnt offering, and he certainly wouldn't have promised them a son.
She filtered his emotional, checkers-like panic through the objective, long-term truth of chess.
I absolutely love the example of Benaiah. David calls him the gold standard. 2 Samuel 23, verse 20 describes him as a valiant man who did mighty deeds.
The scripture specifically notes that he went down into a pit on a snowy day and killed a lion.
Benaiah didn't just sit around the campfire talking about bravery or theorizing about combat. Massive, undeniable actions backed up every single word he ever spoke.
His currency was backed by the gold standard of execution.
Then there is the fascinating story of Obadiah, demonstrating the hidden investment. Obadiah was a high-ranking official serving directly under the intensely wicked King Ahab and Queen Jezebel.
Jezebel was slaughtering the prophets of God, but Obadiah secretly took 100 prophets, hid them in caves, and smuggled bread and water to them to keep them alive.
We see this in 1 Kings 18, verse 13. He didn't make grand public speeches. He didn't virtue signal.
He used his secret influence, his quiet, incredibly dangerous positioning on the board, for a massive long-term return for the kingdom.
And finally, we have the Shunammite woman. David titles her lesson, Binary Integrity. Her young son had just died suddenly in her arms.
Instead of collapsing, she immediately saddled a donkey to ride to the prophet Elisha. As she approaches, Elisha sees her from afar and sends his servant running to meet her,
to ask if everything is all right with her, her husband, and the child. Now, she could have vented her grief. She could have screamed at the servant. She could have cluttered the board with her tragedy.
But look at 2 Kings 4, verse 26. She completely bypassed the servant with 3 decisive, checkers-like words, "It is well."
She absolutely refused to spend her vital currency on the servant because she knew with absolute certainty that she needed every single ounce of her breath, every gold coin of her influence for the prophet who actually possessed the authority to raise her son from the dead.
That is the ultimate breathtaking mastery of the pre-move scan and the fierce discipline of the tongue.
This entire deep dive has been an absolute masterclass. It fundamentally changes the way you view every single conversation, every text message, every meeting you walk into.
As we finally land the plane in our outro, David brings us to the final board and stewardship of the breath.
The ultimate overarching goal of mastering both of these dialects, the soft architectural wisdom of chess to build people up, and the hard, decisive command of checkers to clear away the rot, is to achieve certainty.
David reminds us of a very sobering, eternal reality. God is the ultimate auditor of our influence. He gave us the physical breath to speak, and he gave us the specific boards, our families, our businesses, our ministries to lead upon.
If we choose to live in clutter, if we just spew jargon, make excuses, and waste our breath on idle chatter, we fail our stewardship.
The scriptural accuracy here is paramount, and it should echo in our minds. Matthew 12, verse 36. But I say unto you, that every idle word that men shall speak, they shall give account thereof in the day of judgment.
Every idle word. The inflation of our speech will eventually be audited by the creator of breath itself.
But if we invest our gold wisely, if we speak life, clarity, and truth, we fulfill our absolute purpose on this earth.
I want to leave you, the listener, with a provocative thought, building on everything we have explored today. Consider your own internal monologue.
Think about the words you say to yourself when you are driving alone or staring in the mirror. Are you speaking to yourself using counterfeit currency and idle jargon?
Are you making endless checkers excuses to yourself about why you can't succeed? Or are you using gold words to actively mentor your own heart into the king row?
What board are you playing on when absolutely no one else is in the room?
That is a profound, powerful question to carry with you this week.
Thank you to CA Jail Outreach and Camp Growth for hosting this podcast and for your tireless dedication to sharing hope and truth.
We encourage every listener to explore their vital work via the link provided in the description.
Please join us in thanking David for sharing his heart with us today.
We ask that you keep him in your prayers as he leads this mission.
Furthermore, please lift up Camp Growth in your prayers. This year, we are hosting children who currently have a parent in the jail system for a week of fun, restoration, and peace.
To learn more about how you can support these children and the mission of the camp, please visit the link in the podcast description.
Until the trumpet blows.
We enjoyed our time together and look forward to being with you again. If you need anything, please visit the podcast description where you will find the links to our websites. This is always worth repeating from David. Helping is ordinary. Adding ice makes it extraordinary. There are leaders, and then there are leaders who serve. Among the best are those who always remember to add the ice. Have a great day. We will see you next time.